start our webinar now. Hello, my name is David Randall, Director of Research at the National Association of Scholars, your moderator for our webinar, which is part of our Great American Literature webinar series. This is on Henry James's The Turn of the Screw, and the prompt. What makes The Turn of the Screw a great novel? How has the novella informed or been informed by the horror genre? In what ways is it distinctive from traditional Gothic horror? Who influenced James's writings, and who did his writings influence? How would you describe his place in American literature? Now, I am delighted to have three very distinguished professors speaking with us, and good heavens, I don't actually have their CVs with me on this panel. I will say their names, and you'll forgive me for not giving all of their qualifications. Professors Michael Anesko, Daniel Mark Fogel, and John Carlos Rowe. We normally put into the chat button below some of the distinguished books by them, and I'm going to ask our technical folks to also put in their titles, and indeed maybe if you want to briefly introduce yourself. Apologies about that. So I will add to that what the format is. 12 to 14 minutes each speaking, each of them, in alphabetical order by last name, then a question and answer, which is prompted by you, the audience, putting in your questions into the chat and the Q&A. I might add some questions of my own. I will select the questions based upon how I think it will prompt a conversation. The panelists can even just look in and respond themselves or respond to one another with happy initiative. And if your question does not get answered during this session, I will forward any question you send to randall@nas.org to our panelists, so they may have the option to reply to you. So don't worry about a question not getting answered. Now, I will also say this is going to be recorded on the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel, usually up within 24 hours for perpetuity. So if you have to run away, don't worry, you'll get a chance to see all of this. Having said that, I'm going to ask Professor Anesko, would you be so kind as to start?
Yes, well, thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this webinar. I must say that I was, when the invitation came, I was frankly rather struck by the framing or the rubric for this panel. That is specifically to think of The Turn of the Screw as an example of, quote, the great American novel. And it seemed to me that the one way of coming at that topic, a fruitful way of coming at it, might be to look at it frankly, in reverse order and consider those terms. And to do that, or to help do that, I wanted to share a few slides with the webinar. So I'm going to share my screen. I have a few slides to share with everyone. So I'm going to hit that button, and I hope technically we're okay. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Very good. Well, I guess the first term to consider, and it's not just a question of semantics or nomenclature, to think of The Turn of the Screw as a novel. It was first, the story was first serialized over many weeks in Collier's Weekly. The dates are there on the screen. And I think it's rather interesting that prior to the appearance of the story, the people at Collier's were very eager to publicize the advent of this new work by James. And the editor of the magazine, having solicited this serial from James, was quite unabashed and unashamed of announcing it as a novel, in fact. Several weeks before its first appearance, the appearance of the first serial, Collier's ran this rather interesting forerunner, you might say, to it, announcing, as you can see on the screen, I tried to replicate some of the typography even from the print edition, that the editor takes pleasure in making the announcement that he has arranged with the distinguished novelist, Mr. Henry James, for the publication in serial form of his latest work, written especially, of course, for Collier's Weekly, The Turn of the Screw in large capital letters. But again, further down, you can see announcing it quite specifically as a novel. There were subsequent squibs, I guess you could say, in Collier's in the weeks leading up to the appearance of the first installment, again, repeatedly referring to this story as a novel, certainly leading, I suppose, readers to expect that this is what would be coming. James, however, seems to have had somewhat different ideas about this. As the serial was beginning, here you can see he's beseeching his good friend William Dean Howells, not to read the piece in the magazine, referring to it as a small serial that has just begun to run, and thinking back again to those blurbs, or those squibs, suggesting that it was too portentously announced, by which I think he meant to say that it was perhaps a mistake to announce it as a novel or to have it advertised in those terms. Again, when the story was first published, it did not appear under its own title between the covers individually of a book, but rather was included in these volume called The Two Magics, published both in England and America, but including another short story covering End. Again, I think an interesting distinction that if it had been considered a novel by James, he certainly would have wanted to have it published under its own name, under its own covers. Probably the correct generic classification for this piece would be a novelle, certainly longer than a short story, not as long as a novel, a traditional novel. And as we know and can see certainly from this famous testament in one of his prefaces to the New York edition, James was quite fond of this particular genre, referring to it as quite famously as the beautiful and blessed nouvelle. Certainly probably the right way to think about The Turn of the Screw. Well, what about American then? Is it really even appropriate to think of this tale as an American work of fiction? This story, of course, is set in England. The way it gets itself running, framing itself as part of this venerable tradition of holiday tale telling around the Christmas fire, the Yuletide fire. And of course, the story is just sort of chock full of even rather stereotypical English elements, including those that I've listed there on the slide. I think this would be an interesting question, further for everyone later to consider and debate. That, of course, then brings us to the question of greatness. I think it's rather interesting and rather curious that James himself, on more than one occasion, sort of denigrated The Turn of the Screw, or at least referred to it rather slightingly. This is an example from a letter to his sister-in-law, thanking her, of course, for her compliments about the story. But of course, as you can see, he goes on to claim that the piece perhaps doesn't merit favorable attention. Don't think me ungracious, he says, but the story very limitedly deserves the degree of success it appears to be having. It was conceived and executed as an absolutely mechanical and calculated little potboiler. That's a phrase construction that shows up again and again in his letters referring to this story. To Wells, H.G. Wells, he said the same thing, used the same terminology again to another British colleague, Frederick Myers, referring to it as a rather a shameless potboiler. Perhaps most definitively of all, in a letter to Howells again, called the story the most abject, down on all fours potboiler, pure and simple, that a proud man brought low ever perpetrated. On the other hand, the term received somewhat different sort of qualification in I think, an equally interesting letter that James wrote later, referring to pot boilers again as something, as he says, which represent in the lives of all artists some of the most beautiful things ever done by them. So the evidence on this point, I think, is rather interestingly contradictory. On the one hand, James was inclined to speak rather slightingly of the tale, but then perhaps coming around to belatedly almost to recognize that perhaps it occupies or deserved a better status than what he had first been willing to assign to it. Another measure, I think, of possible greatness might be to think about the way in which the story has lent itself to a great many forms of adaptation. The tale was rewritten as a stage play numerous times, beginning, as I've indicated here, in 1950 with a production called The Innocents, produced on Broadway by Harold Pinter. That same title was assigned to probably the most famous film adaptation of the story, Jack Clayton's film of 1961. It's been also produced on television more than once, I think most recently in this 2009 BBC production, which featured the stars from Downton Abbey of all places. Benjamin Britten, of course, created an opera that was based on the story, and it's even been transformed into a ballet. So it certainly seems to me that that's these different sort of cultural manifestations certainly could be interpreted as evidence of greatness, and a very interesting type of greatness insofar as the story has lent itself or proven itself adaptable in so many different forms and different media. Of course, another, I suppose, more statistical measure of greatness might be taken up by thinking about the sheer number of entries in the MLA bibliography that a search through that database can generate. I did this just recently and not too surprisingly discovered that that search generated 524 separate entries, more than any other work by Henry James, in fact. And that perhaps is another rather bald but statistical measure of a certain kind of greatness. And if we can rely on those numbers, on those statistics, then I think we'd have to conclude that the turn of the screw is in fact decidedly great. Well, those are the essence of my comments.
All right. Thank you so much. Delighted to hear that. And I guess we'll then go to our next speaker, Professor Fogel, if you would be so kind. I think you're still muted.
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Very good. Thank you. Well, first of all, let me thank the association for creating this occasion. It's a kick to be having this discussion with two wonderful fellow James scholars, as well as with the audience when they're able to participate through the chat. I was excited to be asked to do this initially because last summer at the tail end of a sabbatical, I was working on a long chapter on the turn of the screw, but I decided to scrap any reference to that in this discussion and just try to take on the question that has been posed to us and that Michael has in part addressed and I will address in similar ways, which is what makes this thing great. And first, I do think it's great. And I loved rereading it this weekend. Its reception, as Michael points out, over the past century and a quarter, including, I would say, its endless challenges to interpretation and to literary theory, and its constantly proliferating adaptations in multiple genres, have truly ratified its greatness. But what does that greatness consist of? Now, one obvious way of accounting for it is the protean capacity of the tale to accommodate many incompatible and contradictory readings, not just the familiar dialectic of real evil ghosts versus bad hallucinating governess. Beyond that, and beyond the sort of crude psychoanalytic interpretations that Edmund Wilson's pioneering, perhaps brilliant, but really crude Freudianism yields to much more sophisticated psychoanalytic interpretations later on, like the Lacanian deconstructive reading of Shoshana Fellman. But beyond those things, I imagine that nearly all of us devoted to reading H.J. with as much bearing on and usefulness as possible for our current predicaments have found illuminations in a variety of readings of The Turn of the Screw through the lenses of queer, feminist, Marxist theory, through deconstruction. The text is the ultimate text embodying or exemplifying the indeterminacy of literature and language. Practically through all of the philosophical and ideological frameworks that we have available to us, The Turn of the Screw reveals new facets. That may be a fault, but we can debate that later. Clearly, James designed the novella to be very open in the spaces that it leaves for interpretation. He was our greatest Anglo-American theorist of fiction. He anticipated the gap theory of theorists like Esser. And he famously put it to us in the preface to The Turn of the Screw that he was relying on creating gaps. In this passage, only make the reader's general vision of evil intense enough, I said to myself, James wrote in the preface. And his own experience, that is the reader's own experience, his own imagination, his own sympathy with the children and horror of their false friends will supply him quite sufficiently with all the particulars. Make him think the evil, make him think it for himself, and you are released from weak specifications. That famous pronouncement focuses on letting the readers fill in the blanks. My values, James says elsewhere in the preface, are all blanks, but it also highlights, as James does again and again in the preface, and in his other known private and public comments on The Turn of the Screw, aside from all of the ones that Michael cited, that he intended TS to be read as a ghost story. Maybe he was embarrassed by that. Maybe that's partly why he denigrated it, but I think it was the intention. The reader's sympathy, just in the quotation I just gave you, is to be with the children, and the horror for the reader resides in their false friends, Quint and Jessel. And in the preface, there's not a hint that the governess is unreliable. In fact, James declares outright, and I quote, literally, she has authority. He says we're really not interested in her, except as she gives us the picture that the narrative supplies. And we need to see that supernatural foundation of the story in context. After all, belief in communication between the living and the dead is really pervasive even now. According to a November 2021 Pew Research report, 70% of Americans believe in transactions between the living and the dead. And in 1898, such beliefs were not only pervasive, but they were also subjected to vigorous, open-minded investigations by leading intellectuals, including William James, whose presidency of the Society for Psychical Research and whose inability to impeach the psychic powers of Mrs. Leonora Piper, the famed medium, were correlatives of his enormous will to believe. And H.J. evinced a similar will to believe, despite his deep skepticism, in declaring at the end of his late essay, Is There a Life After Death? I reach beyond the laboratory brain. I hasten to say that a supernatural reading of T.S. should not and must not preclude our emphasizing for our moment and our purposes other matters, There's no question that this novella, like others of H.J.'s works, particularly in this period, may be read as grappling with issues of authority and its absence or removal, with, as in the guardian uncle who abdicates all of his responsibility for the children, with the nature of signification, with issues all implicated in each other of class, sexual orientation, gender, power relations, particularly power relations in which women and children are the victims. Now, all of the meanings latent in the tale that we've teased out of it over the decades are part of its richness and its fascination. I want to highlight quickly a few additional aspects of the tale that, to my mind, help to answer the question of why it's a great American novella. First, it seems to me that James uncannily anticipates, here and in many others of his works, one of the most interesting aspects of current research in neuroscience, a phenomenon known as brain-to-brain coupling, amply documented in research papers on the NIH website, which explore the ways in which brain-to-brain coupling creates social worlds. Brain-to-brain coupling is visible on functional magnetic resonance imaging machines when at given moments the brain waves of two or more individuals precisely match each other. Just as James's tale has latent within it themes close to the bone of current concerns such as those salient when we read it through the lenses of feminism, deconstruction, queer theory, etc., James's narrative also looks forward to cutting-edge research that provides physiological, psychological evidence supporting what Sharon Cameron described more than 30 years ago in her book Thinking in Henry James, the decentering of consciousness, which often seems to reside not in individual characters, but to float freely between them. Neuroscience now can document what James intuited and inveterately represented. That complex wordless communication operates between embodied brains, supporting seemingly unerring intuitions of each other's thoughts, but so that, for instance, there is frequently no need for Mrs. Gross, the housekeeper, Fly, and the governess to complete their sentences. So effectively do they convey their implications to each other without voicing them. The topic of brain-to-brain coupling has a scientific lineage, moreover, that goes back to William James's psychological research, notably the James Lang theory of emotions that posits that physiological reactions precede the registration of emotions. Another aspect of the tale's greatness, it seems to me, is its modernity, and particularly the way in which its sense of existential terror, of the horrors that James evokes through the tale. The word horror and horrors appear 15 times in the New York edition text of The Turn of the Screw. The way in which he invokes the terror is resonant with the evocation of the horror of modernity in Conrad's Heart of Darkness. Long ago, Leon Dell commented on the striking parallels between the two novellas, Conrad's having been published just a year after Henry James's. Among those we might note are the employment of frame narratives, the reverberation of the word horror through both texts, and the echo of Mrs. Gross's stunning revelation to the governess that the man she has twice seen at Bly died well before the governess ever arrived there. Quote, Mr. Quint is dead, says Mrs. Gross. That is echoed in the announcement that immediate follows Kurtz's ultimate utterance, the horror, in Conrad's tale, Mr. Kurtz, he dead. The third aspect of the tale that makes it a great American fiction, I have avoided saying the novel too, is the sheer unrelenting, steadily rising intensity of the narrative. I'd propose, as Peter Biebler has suggested, that Turn of the Screw was one of H.J.'s most successful applications of the lessons he learned during his theatrical years, not only in the very skillful dialogue, but in particular I want to point us to the 5-part structure of the serialization in Collier's Illustrated Weekly, which intimates that the 5-act structure of tragedy underlies the steadily rising tension and drama of TS. Even though the 5 parts were not demarcated in the first book publication of TS or in the New York edition, readers experience as they make their way through the narrative the familiar sequence of exposition, rising action, complication and peripety, catastrophe, and denouement. Finally, I want to point out something else that distinguishes HJ in general, and this text in particular, and I want to revert here to the formal and literary, however much I risk in doing so the derision of my old friend John Rowe, who I think has never had a kind word to say about formalism. But I would argue that the TS would not have risen to the status of great American novella if it were not touched throughout by James's language, by the beauty and power of his prose, and by its evocations through nuance and indirection of the almost unimaginable evil that James seeks to evoke. By the way, I think that is one very American element of the tale, perhaps, Michael, with Hawthornian roots. Of all James's scores, if not hundreds of gifted commentators, it seems to me that Virginia Woolf got this literary aspect better than anyone else in observing Henry James is only to take the smallest of steps and he is over the border. His characters with their extreme fineness of perception are already halfway out of the body. Focusing on tone and atmosphere, Woolf closes Mr. Henry James's Ghost Stories, the leader in the Times Literary Supplement for December 22, 1921, with a powerful paragraph on James's making us afraid in Turn of the Screw, of something unknown, of something perhaps, she says, in ourselves. And I will just close with the opening of that last paragraph. Woolf writes, perhaps it is the stillness that first impresses us. Everything at Bly is so profoundly quiet. The twitter of birds at dawn, the faraway cries of children, false footsteps, faint footsteps in the distance, stir it, but leave it unbroken. It accumulates, it weighs us down, it makes us strangely apprehensive of noise. At last, the house and the garden die out beneath it. Quote, I can hear again as I write the intense hush in which the sounds of evening drops. The rooks stopped cawing in the golden sky, and the friendly hour lost for the unspeakable minute all its voice, close quote. It is unspeakable. We know that the man who stands on the tower staring down at the governess beneath is evil. Some unutterable obscenity has come to the surface. It tries to get in, it tries to get at something. The exquisite little beings lie innocently asleep, must at all events be protected, but the horror grows. So I pass the torch to John.
Thank you so much. And yes, Dr. Rowe, if you'd be so kind.
I'm happy to follow my distinguished colleagues, and I want to thank them very much for illuminating comments. And I'll share my screen here. I'll show you a brief PowerPoint. I'll try to remember to come back to my actual face with sharing the screen. Sometimes I do it too much while teaching, but let's see where we are. I'm going to leave my slides on the left-hand side up so you can see where we're going, so I also can remind myself where we're going. The question about James's success in creating a classic work in the Turn of the Screw is best initiated, as Dan mentioned in his remarks, although with some criticism of Edmund Wilson, by Edmund Wilson's The Ambiguity of Henry James, first published in Hound and Horn in 1934, and later collected in his book, The Triple Thinkers. But the real issue is, I think, for the classic status of the work, that it is a radically ambiguous narrative that James worked hard in order to make it impossible to make the decision. Here, I will stop sharing my screen for a moment. My cursor shows up. Stop the share. In which James went to considerable lengths to make certain that it was impossible to provide textual evidence to support conclusively either the proposition that the ghosts had reality and therefore confirmed the superstitions or the belief in the supernatural of a lot of his contemporary readers, and as Dan pointed out, a lot of subsequent people to our present moment and into the future, or that they were figments of the phantasmatic imagination of the governess. But I also think, having acknowledged that greatness on the part of the work, that you can't tell whether it's one or the other, I also think that James created a narrative in which there were unintended consequences, which I'll come to in a moment. This definition of the classic as a radically ambiguous text is specific in Frank Kermode's The Classic, Literary Images of Permanence and Change, published quite some time ago in 1983, but still a wonderful guide to what a classic really is. He distinguishes between a traditional classic, I'll leave that aside for the moment, and the modern classic, which is what I think we all agree The Turn of the Screw is. And he really defines the modern classic as one that employs a radical ambiguity in order to encourage what he terms a readerly text, or to encourage, and here I'll stop the share again for a moment, to encourage reader response and to motivate the reader's participation in the text. That's characteristic of a whole range of modern literature, not just Henry James, and it's perhaps one of the reasons that James, so Victorian in many of his characteristic styles and features, is still understood rightly to be an origin or a founding figure in the modernist movement and many of its avant-garde stylistic innovations and formal innovations. But here I turn to this other topic I raised a moment ago, that is the kinds of ambiguity that are in The Turn of the Screw. On the one hand, I affirm that James was brilliant, even a genius, at manipulating certain kinds of intended ambiguities, the supernatural versus the psychological on the left-hand side of the slide, the class disparities and what I consider the voodoo effects. I don't think James would much care for the voodoo description of these effects, but the way in which characters like the uncle in London manipulate and control the governess even without being present at Bly, so that she operates out of a kind of fear of his displeasure. Never under any circumstances write to me, as he makes that claim in their initial meeting or the interview in London. And of course, James also intended to talk about the sexual repression and fantasy in the text in terms of an ambiguity you can't put your finger on. Who's really repressing this? Is it the governess as a relatively young woman who has been protected from, by Victorian morality, from the exposure to the kind of sexuality that is clearly visible in the uncle and in the uncle's apartment or home in London? We never know exactly what. Or is it a projection of the fantasy of so many of us readers and of other characters in the narrative? And the other intended ambiguity, I think, on James's part is that between parents and children. Who really is in charge of parents and children like Miles and Flora? Is the governess really governing those children, or are they in some sense, loosed or released from the authority and control or the superego of parents and the family? All of that, I think, is typical of the intended ambiguity that makes the text so fascinating to us and involves the reader in what James wanted us to worry about as we read it. But equally important to me are the unintended ambiguities that James is unable, I think, to control. Women in the 19th century workplace. He writes so often about women. He's famous for his psychological accounts of the interiority of women, that he still has a wide following among feminist readers and feminist activists, although considerable anxiety in the discussion of his place in relationship to women's rights in the 19th century and into the early 20th century. I think James has his own concerns about the governess as truly a woman in the workplace, even though she is in a workplace and charged with considerable responsibility, not just over those children, but over a valuable property and the employees at that country estate, including Mrs. Gross. I think there's unintended ambiguity that represents James's anxiety, his inability to address homosexuality in late Victorian England after the Wilde trials in 1895. The Oscar Wilde trials that basically provided the legal precedent for the Labouchere amendment, the criminal act that criminalized homosexuality. There is a good deal of subtext regarding homosexuality in Turn of the Screw that has made the text a continuing topic for discussion, as our own anxieties about sexual identity in the 20th and 21st century, those anxieties have continued to provoke public debate. That relates also to the suggestions and the hints of child abuse and pedophilia, which I think if we had James in front of us, he might have said, I didn't mean that. I'm not sure what that means. I have anxieties about it. Of course, it's been demonstrated that gay men are no more inclined to child abuse or pedophilia than men or women in the rest of society. But certainly in the late 19th century, there was that suggestion in the culture, and Peter Quint's relationship with Miles certainly hints in that direction. And finally, there's the unintended ambiguity of the Irish and Henry James. Of course, his grandfather had come from County Cavan, Ireland, and yet James himself often demonized the Irish in his own writings, going back to Mrs. Bread, the servant, serving woman in The American by Henry James. What is James's relationship to his own Irish backgrounds? Where does the Irish come up in Turn of the Screw? It's just a brief touch, a stereotype, of course, but it's when the governess describes the first appearance of Peter Quint on that tower to Mrs. Gross. It's the second time she's described Peter Quint. She refers to the red hair. Of course, not entirely convincing as evidence that Peter Quint is Irish, but a strong suggestion. So we have the intended and the unintended suggestions of ambiguities in the Turn of the Screw by Henry James. Must make sure I don't take up the time for our discussion. I'll go back to my last slides now, and I'll repeat something that Michael Anesko said in his presentation. Turn of the Screw is, of course, the evidence that it is a modern classic. It has the most, numerically, the most adaptations, and also the most adaptations to diverse media of any work by Henry James. I refer here, I show you the movie posters for two films, one of which was mentioned by Michael, Jack Clayton's The Innocents, based on that play. that was produced on Broadway, and Michael Winner's The Nightcomers, the prequel to The Turn of the Screw. A much neglected film, by the way, The Nightcomers, a really remarkable one. But what's to be said about these two films, and is still relevant to us today, I think, is the extent to which they bear down on the suggestions of sexual deviance and the problem of changing sexual identity in Turn of the Screw. Right? So the adaptations reflect not all of them, of course, but the adaptations reflect the problem of sexuality, certainly that James intended us to worry about, but goes beyond his own specific intentions. One final slide, and I'll be finished with my presentation. The Turn of the Screw, an American classic. James would not become a British citizen until 1915, but The Turn of the Screw is very, very British, as I believe Michael began our presentations with. Those country houses and the feudal rules that govern them, there's really no one for the governess to go and consult in order to say, I think I have a problem here, once the uncle says never under any circumstances communicate with me. There's no police department she can call up. And that's very typical of the landed estate situation in 19th century England rather than 19th century America. Governesses and illiterate daughters of country parsons, that is, of course, the background to the governess. That's a typical or a stock figure from the 19th century British novel, if not also its heritage in the 18th century English novel. Gothic romances have a much more powerful influence on British literature in the 19th century than they do on American literature, but we could certainly discuss that. And there's finally the topic of British imperialism, which figures in the narrative in just a kind of throwaway gesture toward what happened to the father of Miles and Flora. And it's a younger military brother who dies in India, as is indicated in the narrative. So this is a very, very British narrative, despite the fact that James remains an expatriate writer when he's writing it and when it's published in 1898. Just by way of contrast here, I'll mention the recent Floria Sigismondi's The Turning, the adaptation of The Turn of the Screw from 2020, a film set in Maine. And I say here, stuff and nonsense. James is not Stephen King. This is not the kind of horror we find in Stephen King, much as we might admire Stephen King. And the film had to be shot not in Maine or in New England or in America, but in order to get the aura of place that Sigismondi wanted, it had to be filmed at Kilruddery House in County Wicklow, Ireland, again, that Fairchild estate from the adaptation. So I don't think this is an American classic at all. It is a modern classic and quite a brilliant one that relies on strategic ambiguity that James manipulated to very good effect. A level of genius, much as I hate using that word, as Dan well knows, but also creating unintended ambiguities that have kept us fascinated by Turn of the Screw for a very, very long time. And I thank you very much for the invitation, and I will stop there.
David, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes.
Oh, I have no idea. I'm sorry. I was not muted on my end. So I was encouraging everybody to put in their questions into chat and Q&A immediately so I can pass them along. I am going to ask, there's been talk about influence. I guess I want to ask you a question about Henry James's own development, which I forgive me if I'm blanking on something one of you said. What role does it play in Henry James's own literary development? Of prose, of style, of plot, approach, point of view, character, everything, anything.
Well, I could just jump in here and say, I think, and Dan, I think, touched on this somewhat, that when you think about the pacing of this story, and again, I was really struck too by the conditions of its first appearance as a serial in, of all places, Collier's Weekly, and just how carefully James had designed those individual installments to build an intensity and increase the level of suspense to keep the reader engaged. And in that sense, again, I think it's worth pointing out the connection that however much he failed as a playwright, he certainly learned something from that experience, and the benefit of it, I think, is felt in a piece like The Turn of the Screw, which has a very calculated architecture, behind it, clearly mapped out, planned very deliberately to engage, the reader's imagination. In a sense, almost to unleash the reader's imagination to speculate about the nature of evil, the nature of reality, the nature of supernaturalism, for that matter. So in that sense, I think it really does mark a stage, a very clear stage in his own development as a writer in terms of thinking about the architecture of his stories. I mean, famously, many of the other pieces that he wrote were simply got out of control. I mean, he himself, conceded this, that he would start writing a serial, it would start appearing in a magazine, and they would never stop. They just kept coming. But this piece was written in its entirety before the first serial installment, appeared. And so in that sense, he was exercising a much different kind of control over the composition of it. Unlike many of his other serials, which, as I say, just ran on almost uncontrollably, and in ways that, fortunately, editors were clement, to continue to publish him. But I mean, that happened in virtually all of his previous serialized novels. They all just kind of ran away.
I think I would add to the placement of Turn of the Screw in his career that it has always occupied a kind of weird position prior to the major phase novels of the early 20th century, The Ambassadors, The Golden Wings of the Dove, and The Golden Bull. Those are the ones that we identify with his kind of crazy style, and they're hard to read and they're long, as Michael was referring to, the kind of novels that got away from him, and so forth. And Turn of the Screw, 1898, just a few years before those major phase novels, doesn't seem to fit. Pretty clear, the style, it's eloquent, as Dan suggests, which he's right, it is, but it is pretty clear. The ambiguities are there in what's happening. And it's set in the distant past of the 19th century. That frame tale sends us back in the kind of murky past of the governess's earlier experiences. So it doesn't seem very modern, but it is really very, very modern, because the fantastic experiences that she has and the children have with these wacky surrogate parents, the governess and Mrs. Gross and the absent uncle, are very much the phenomena, the social phenomena James would be dealing with in those major phase novels and beyond. So it's a remarkable achievement to write something that's set in the countryside, a rural setting, away from the big city, and in that dim past that is really addressing the modern shocks that we all have experienced, or certainly his readers have experienced, or we're still living through.
And I would only add in relation to the question of where this fits into James's career, maybe to re-emphasize that he wrote a whole string of stories in which children are victimized and women are victimized. And, you know, one is tempted to say, especially if, like me, you are influenced by Leon Adele's reading of Henry James, to say this starts with the debacle over the failure of his play Guy Domville, but that's not really right. And in fact, the decade of the 90s opens when James isn't writing novels, he's just writing short stories while he concentrates on theatrical success. But he writes a story called The Pupil, which strikingly ends like The Turn of the Screw, with the death of a little boy, with a issue in the heart. You know, by the way, I also wanted to mention, because somebody, was it Michael or John? It was John, one of John's slides that had the voodoo in it and the voodoo manipulation of the governess. One of the things I've been writing about lately is William James's theory of interoception, which I won't go into here now, except that it leads directly to a very famous formulation by a physiologist in the early 1940s of a phenomenon called voodoo death, which is essentially, for instance, when the shaman points a finger at you and you die the next morning with no known organic cause of death. Actually a well-documented phenomenon, and it can be related to what happens to Miles, perhaps to what happens to Morgan Marine and The Pupil. But, you know, I will mention, even though I'm chipping away at it a little bit, Adele's very colorful narrative that James, in the series of stories about exploited and injured and, in fact, murdered children, was going through a process of self-psychoanalysis to heal himself from the trauma of the theatrical failure. It's a nice story anyway, if folks don't know it.
I want to pick up on a question by John Wormuth. There are two JWs who've done questions, but John Wormuth first. You know, other titles by Henry James and how they contrast. I want to connect that, however, actually to what you were just saying about short stories. It strikes me that the casual reader of Henry James may have, frankly, only read his novels and not read many of the short stories. And I guess my query is, how much, this I suppose more broadly, how much are we losing by not knowing about Henry James, the short storyist? And I guess more specifically, should we be thinking of The Turn of the Screw and comparing it more with the short stories than with the novels, or as much of the shorts with the short stories as with the novels?
Actually, I think that may be a misperception, David. I think a lot of my undergraduates know James short stories. They don't know the novels. You know, I've met a few in the last just few months have mentioned to me that they had read The Wings of the Dove or The Portrait of a Lady, but most of them, even if they're not English majors, if they've taken one course in literary theory, they've been led through The Beast in the Jungle and Eve Sedgwick's reading of it as The Beast in the Closet. I think there are a number of James stories that are quite well known and maybe read as much as The Turn of the Screw, even though we wonder how much the rising generation will keep reading.
Oh, that's interesting.
Although,
thank you.
I think I would add to this that I agree with Dan that I think students, insofar as they still read James, they often, maybe even increasingly, read short stories because of their brevity. But James wrote over 100 short stories. There are quite a few of them that people never talk about. There's probably a scholarly essay on every single one, but there are a lot that are pretty minor. And when Michael was reading about the passages about James referring to Turn of the Screw as a pot boiler, I kept thinking of how many of those stories are, I think James himself would say, were pot boilers. You know, I just had to crank it out. I was trying to make a buck. And they are fascinating to read today, maybe not for students to read, some of them maybe, but for us as scholars to read. I try to do this in my new book. to read some of the potboiler stories in terms of the content that they have for contemporary social and political events. He's really a wonderful commentator. You know, he's treated so much as the aesthete, drinking port in the club with his buddies, you know, smoking cigarettes, but he was a wonderful commentator on, you know, social political life. And that comes through in even some of the crummiest stories that he ever wrote. So I think it's good for us to go back to those, you know, as scholars. Maybe this is an agenda for the coming years.
You know, I wanted to throw in something, if I could, quickly about a possible political resonance of the turn of the screw, that actually something that John wrote about this years ago prompted me to think of, and that is that at a moment like ours, when we are facing the rise of authoritarianism and we're looking at what Putin is doing, the idea that authority is removed and absent is, in a way, James striking for freedom, which is what James always struck for, going back to the art of fiction and his pleas for freedom for the novelist. I think there is, despite James being in some constructions, including his own, the master with a capital M, there's an anti-authoritarian scene in the way his work deconstructs itself.
I agree.
Dr.
So.
Anesko, I don't think you've
I got it
answered
from
this
you, John,
question
but
yet.
I just wanted to say it. I thought you would.
Oh, sorry.
Well, and just to go back to the question of pot boiling and property, I think it is interesting also to remember that it was exactly at this point in James's, sort of personal and professional life that he was very anxious about acquiring his own country house in Sussex, and had just, in fact, signed a 21-year lease on Lamb House. Was very much concerned, we know this from his letters and other documents, about raising the money to furnish the house, to maintain both his apartment or his flat in London as well as this new property. And so pot boiling, or making the pot boil, was certainly very much on his mind. I mean, another thing that struck me too, just thinking a little bit more about it, if we think about the context of the story, when Miles dies, he would have been the heir to that property, because of course the uncle has no children, is not likely to have any legitimate ones anyway. And so, I mean, I don't know exactly where to go with that, but it just struck me as an interesting, almost footnote or detail to think about the material background of the story, and what's going to happen to the property down the line.
I did.
John, do you have any thoughts about that?
I wrote about this quite some time ago in an essay that became a chapter in the Theoretical Dimensions of Henry James called Screwball. And it was in response to Shoshana Fellman's very sophisticated but also opaque Lacanian, Viridian reading of the tale. And I tried to suggest there was a very specific material interest that the uncle had in sending the governess to Bly House, because Miles would be the heir if the uncle did not. This is according to Blackstone's commentaries, by the way, which I had to read very carefully, the relevant portions of about primogeniture, which drove me almost crazy. But if the uncle did not demonstrate that he was exercising his authority over this property, he would lose it to a relative who in fact did have a claim on the property, second in position to the uncle's, but that would be Miles.
Yeah, exactly.
So he goes to great lengths to send the governess down to Bly to hold on to that valuable property. And you can imagine what fun I had then spinning out that the hauntings and the supernatural events were a consequence, not just of sexual repression, but of the distortion of these material interests about which the governess has no clue. She's not because she has no property, she's not thinking about this at all. But the upper class reader would be sticking, his or her tongue saying, oh my God, he's going to lose that property. Who cares about the little brat? So I think it's I didn't put it that crudely in my prose, but I think it's a really fascinating ambiguity, which I believe James does build in. That's a material one that I think he certainly intends us to get.
I want to build, if I may, actually, on what you said about the upper class reader, and then connect that, if I may, to the next question we've gotten, and I encourage more to come in, from James Wallace. Beyond the cultural elite or literary circles, how much did Henry James affect society as a whole with The Turn of the Screw and other works? That is, everyday people of his times and beyond. And I want to push that again to, what was the popular readership of it? When he was writing, he was presumably anticipating an audience of, not just elites, but, middle-class popular. And to what extent was he writing for a larger audience, and to what extent did it connect with a larger mass audience?
Well, the fact that it was serialized in a publication like Collier's, certainly would have given him, afforded him a very wide audience. I don't know the exact circulation numbers of that magazine at the time, but I do know that the editor who solicited the story was the son of the founder of the magazine, and he was in fact quite deliberately trying to reinvent the magazine to broaden its appeal, to give it perhaps, certainly by asking James, a certain kind of cultural legitimacy or sophistication that perhaps it previously had not been able to brag about. But in any case, there certainly would have been thousands and thousands of readers of that serial. Now, they didn't all run out and buy the Two Magics. The sales of James's books by that point were, relatively modest. But certainly the story would have been reviewed and talked about in other newspapers and journals at the time.
And in terms of readership in that period, Michael's our expert here, but I would just throw in the idea that, James is playing very cagily the boundary line between a rising middle class, really an upper middle class, and an aristocratic class, which is again why this is very much a British narrative. He's trying to appeal to an aspiring upper middle class that has property, that has, that will inherit wealth or wants to pass on wealth, and that very often is emulating a landed aristocracy and a titled aristocracy in Britain. So he can twit both. He can twit the upper classes for being too aspiring, you're too much a bunch of climbers, but he can also twit the aristocracy carefully, that your time is passing. It's a fascinating way in which he addresses two related but also competitive reading communities in that period.
Yeah, I just add that I think Collier's was very much a sort of lower middle brow mass circulation, and this is an example of the highbrow Henry James entering with some trepidation, and maybe this is another reason why he insisted on saying repeatedly, mere potboiler, about the tale, that it's the highbrow entering that middle brow space. But it's also Michael can comment on this perhaps with greater depth of knowledge than I have, but my impression has always been that The Turn of the Screw created a much greater stir among the general public than any work that Henry James had published since Daisy Miller.
Well, I think that's probably true, Dan. I mean, we've all touched on this in different ways. I mean, certainly in contrast to some of the other later works, the style of the Turn of the Screw is relatively transparent and straightforward. One might assume that because James is writing for this more or less mass market audience, that it was crafted that way quite deliberately. Although on the other hand, maybe a point of comparison or contrast would be The Awkward Age, which was also published in a weekly periodical in Harper's Weekly, almost on the heels of this. And I think by comparison, that novel is certainly much more difficult to, I think, work through. And it's always astonished me that a periodical like Harper's Weekly would even have accepted it for publication in that format, because I just don't even, to me, it would seem to be almost unreadable in small little snippets like that. But
especially for an American audience.
mm-hmm.
There's such another English work.
Yeah.
May I actually follow up on that American audience? When would the British audience have first read Turn of the Screw then?
Well, probably not until it was published in book form by Heinemann. I doubt very much whether Collier's had any kind of British circulation to speak of. It would be hard to imagine how or why, if only because of the publication schedules. I mean, if it's coming out week after week after week, the ships just couldn't move that quickly across the water.
And that,
And-
yeah, that
So
was
later, the Two Magics came out in the fall of 1898.
Yeah.
The serialization concluded in April, so
Yes, yeah.
there wasn't a big lag time for the Brits.
and yet that was a standard operating procedure for James throughout a long career of, taking something that he had published in an American magazine or journal and then publishing it soon after in book form with other work, if it happened to be a novella like Turn of the Screw or short fiction in Britain. In his effort, kind of highly engineered effort, which Michael has written about, to build British reading support for his work. He wanted to be a successful, not just resident of the UK, getting royalties from American publishers. He wanted to be a member of the inner literary and social circles of the UK at that time. And for a while he was successful, but it's right, it was either Michael or Daniel who said this a moment ago. He's in the 1890s, 1898, his fortunes are declining. And the purest evidence of that is, very rotten sales for the novels of the major phase and the complete collapse of the New York edition, into which he put an enormous amount of effort and labor, not the least of which was to get the superb photographs by the young and later very successful photographer Alvin Langdon Coburn. That's one of the sad stories of James's career, that multi-volume set, so exquisitely designed. I don't mean exquisite because of style or aesthetics, but exquisitely designed in order to showcase James's achievement, sold so poorly.
So I have a question in mind, but I'll take this moment to encourage other people to do it. I'm interested about his influence on writers in other languages. I mean, are there notable strands of influence? I mean, if I were to say, does magic realism have any, Spanish language have any traces back to Henry James? Would that be completely, specious, or could one say that's a genuine trend? And so on. What are his influences? How does he influence people in other literatures?
Well, it's certainly true that this story has been translated or adapted in different forms in many other languages apart, other than English. But beyond that, I don't have any specific examples that I could adduce to answer that question more specifically.
Was that a general question or just about the Turn of the Screw, David?
I was making it specifically about Turn of the Screw, but actually, if you want to expand it about his influence in general on on other literatures, that would be very interesting.
It's more than literature. It's film, it's culture, and I think it's pretty pervasive. I mean, I just think, for instance, of the presence of Henry James in French film. and he's all over. Truffaut was deeply into Henry James. He made a film called The Green Room based on The Altar of the Dead. And gosh, what's the other one it's based on? I guess it's The Beast in the Jungle and The Altar and the Dead of the Dead. And you know, there's a whole bunch of recent French directors who allude critically to Henry James. What was the movie about the accountant who was mistaken for a psychoanalyst by a woman? Very interesting movie. And the key to the whole film is The Beast from the Jungle. It's a fine French film. I know. Anyway, sorry, but it's all over. James's influence is all over other cultures and literatures, but probably most pervasive in The Turn of the Screw. I think the latest sort of filmography of The Turn of the Screw, which was of Henry James, which was updated in the Henry James Review in the last couple of years, showed a ridiculous number of adaptations of The Turn of the Screw. And to be sure, The Innocents is the most famous, but there's 7 to 10 a year in television in languages all over the world.
He had a huge influence on the Latin American boom as well. As you mentioned, David, Borges is the most obvious one, but that's probably because so many of the boom writers from all over Latin America studied in, European capitals, whether it was Madrid or Paris, before, writing their major works. And of course, James was one of those founders of Modernismo. Great, the Alejo Carpentier, The Lost Steps has got echoes and allusions to Henry James in it. We could keep going down the list of that Latin American venue. And of course, James then has this huge resurgence in, a revival in post-war Japan. Japanese authors are fascinated in James. That's a little harder to figure out because it's so culturally different or distant. And you, of course, see it in Ishiguro's novels, but he's an expatriate Japanese in Britain, so you could say similar to James in that regard. But again, with the cultural differences that are not quite easy to resolve and to explain. But another topic of great interest, I think.
And I'd add, I guess you were only asking about other literatures, but certainly in English and American literature, James is a very powerful presence for a lot of writers, from Philip Roth and Cynthia Ozick to Colm Toynbee. A lot of their work draws on James in very rich ways. One thinks, and connecting to The Turn of the Screw, I suppose the obvious classic locus classicus in post-World War II American literature is Philip Roth's The Ghostwriter.
Yeah, Nathan Zuckerman in the Ghostwriter series seems to be obsessed with James, and yet, and Roth both hates and loves James. You can tell it's not only the character Nathan Zuckerman. It's a long story, but you can tell that Roth is taking his vengeance for his undergraduate forced reading of Henry James as important writer. So we have to be careful what we teach. We could have some famous writer in the class who later vilifies us by vilifying poor Henry James. But that's a charming trace in Philip Roth, the way James comes back again and again, the repressed that motivates Roth's repetition compulsion. Having talked a little bit too much, I'm going to say goodbye to everyone because I have my class coming up and have to these days navigate the multiple platforms required to teach. I've really enjoyed it, to seeing you, Michael, and Dan and David, to having you host us, getting to know you here today. Thank you all, and to Chris and Chance, I can barely read, for handling the organization of this entire panel. as well as the technology, which these days is always complicated. So thank you all. I hope I'll see Dan and Michael at a James conference in the future in some exotic place.
Let's all go to Kyoto.
We can only hope.
Kyoto.
Yeah.
Yes, be great. If we can fly on an airplane again, that would be a great pleasure. So bye, everyone. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Hi, John. Great to see you.
And I'm actually going to keep the two of you on for a bit longer because we are planning to stay on for until about 3:30. We've got a question I want to get to from the audience, but I actually wanted to pick up on what John was just saying about teaching. I was going to ask you, how do you teach Turn of the Screw? I mean, this is a pedagogical question, but it's not just a question of the research, it's a question of how do you introduce it to students? What do you emphasize to undergraduates when you're getting them to read it for the first time?
Well, I actually taught the Turn of the Screw. I would even have to maybe confess, perhaps for the first time, just a couple of years ago when I was assigned to teach a class on the short story. And I included, I think, if I remember correctly, this was a number of years ago, just two works of, well, no, maybe three of James's. But the first we did was Daisy Miller, which was certainly intended to give them, if you will, kind of a friendly introduction to James. That being a much earlier story, that was still a very fine one, but certainly not really presenting many stylistic or linguistic difficulties for undergraduates to wrestle with. The Turn of the Screw, of course, is somewhat more advanced in that regard, but having given them some background and laid the sort of a foreground for this, then my students, at least, were really very much taken with the story. We had very interesting discussions, as I recall, about many of the issues that John had very usefully outlined for us about again, sort of the intended versus the unintended forms of ambiguity in the story. I certainly I remember that quite a number of the students in the class were very positively affected by being exposed to James in that way. And so I felt that teaching it was frankly something of a success.
I can't comment on this one, David. Unlike Michael, who only taught it for the first time a couple of years ago, I've only, as far as I can recall, taught it once in a graduate seminar on Henry James. The problem with Henry James is, even with a tale as talked about and as famous as The Turn of the Screw, if you want to teach a unit on Henry James or a semester on Henry James, you've got 22 novels, you've got 112 short stories and novellas, and you have to be very selective. So, but I know the way I would teach it, and it would be kind of with an emphasis on the things that John captured in his second slide, the masterful manipulation of the what I would call the plurisignification, the ambiguity of the story, how cunningly it's designed. I think students like that, but students would like this. I mean, the problem with teaching this to students is, I just taught Frankenstein a couple of weeks ago in a British Lit survey, and it is the ability for students to experience that text directly is such a revelation, because they only know it through popular culture and through a very distorted popular culture. So I think The Turn of the Screw may have something of that status. With they may know more about Henry James and the supernatural from the strange Netflix adaptation of 6 different stories called The Haunting of Bly Manor, which was aired in 2020. Then they haven't read the text itself.
Yeah. I am going to go from there to a question from Daniel. Why do you believe The Turn of the Screw resonated with a general audience?
Well, I think, if you just go back to even the opening pages of the serial, James really sort of teases his readership with the very idea of that he's playing with a very popular form. I mean, a genre almost of this holiday tradition of tale telling. And the story opens up, I think, so brilliantly with this group of people gathered around the fire at a country house. Various people are relating stories to one another, but the narrator confesses that most of them are not very interesting. But then someone pops in and says, oh, but I've got one that you just won't believe, and starts dropping the hints and dropping suggestions as to, just what kind of masterpiece he has hidden away. And it's that way that the story then unfolds. And it's just, I think, a brilliant way of just roping the reader in, the general reader in, to anticipate that this is not going to be just another story, another conventional ghost story, but something, that's going to be taken to a much different level. And I think all of us would probably concede that the Turn of the Screw succeeds in doing just that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's, aside from the popularity of the genre generally, and more specifically, this Christmas ghost story, which, runs way back into the 18th century and forward. Joyce's The Dead is a sort of Christmas ghost story, not long on the heels of the Turn of the Screw. But I just to borrow a phrase from a minor novella by Henry James, a very interesting one called The Papers, The Turn of the Screw is a rattling good tale. People feel that when they read it. It does, as I said, in comparing it to the 5-act structure that it had in the serialization, mounting intensity. And as far as the ending of each episode, each installment in Collier's goes, 24 doesn't have much on it for cliffhangers.
You almost, this is perhaps then I'll go from there to a pop culture question. So are we then waiting for the great TV series of The Turn of the Screw, a 12-part TV series of it?
Oh, but
One
it's already,
hour per episode, a chapter?
it's already been done. Don't you remember Dark Shadows?
Oh, okay. All right.
The whole premise of that series was actually, based on The Turn of the Screw.
I'm behind the times. It's terrible. I'm not good at
This is from a long time ago, admittedly, but it was an extremely popular daytime soap opera, really, but certainly intended to have a more kind of juvenile audience with ghosts and vampires and hauntings and so forth. But the lineage is, I think, quite direct.
I am going to say we're approaching our 3:30. I think what I would love to do is ask the two of you to have some concluding statements on Henry James' Turn of the Screw, and then I'll have a little bit of concluding material for NAS. But let's do it in reverse order this time, alphabetically. Dr. Fogel, may I ask if you would have concluding statements?
Thank you, David. I hope that people who have joined us today are moved to go back and read the story with some of the different angles on it that they've heard articulated today playing through their minds as they try to re-experience what readers experienced then. And we can't, of course. We can only see it through our own eyes now. It is, as Michael and John both said, that it's straightforward and clear. I think there are actually difficult passages in it, and that in that technique of irresolvable, bottomless ambiguity, and in the way it teases us, it really is just another example of what made Henry James's historically Victorian fiction, the bridge to modernism. I think one sees it even in a tale designed for the mass market, like The Turn of the Screw. In the ways, for instance, that I pointed to its resonance with Heart of Darkness. I'll leave it at that. Pleasure to be here with all of you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Anesko.
Well, just speaking from relatively close personal experience, I guess I should be happy to report that I mentioned to a number of friends here in town recently that I was going to be participating in this event, and that our discussion was going to focus on The Turn of the Screw. And most of these people, they're certainly not members of the English department or students, but older adults who probably had heard of Henry James in one way or another, and maybe even knew that I had spent much of my life thinking and writing about him. But they really quite across the board, they all became rather intrigued. And I know for a fact that at least 2 or 3 of them went out and read the story because we talked about it subsequently. And so I took that as a kind of a small triumph of advocacy, at least for creating perhaps some new readers for James, people who had never dipped into him before, but were sufficiently intrigued to want to pick up this tale and experience it, and clearly found or took a degree of pleasure in that experience. So for those in the audience who have not yet had that pleasure for themselves, I'd certainly echo what Dan was saying too, that for many, James of course is an acquired taste, but once you've acquired it, the pleasures that he can give the reader, I think, are quite remarkable and substantial. And The Turn of the Screw is probably as good a way of introducing yourself to Henry James as anything else.
Thank you so much. I'll just say, by the way, for me, the most gripping Henry James I've read is What Maisie Knew. So I recommend that to one and all. Granted, it may be a minority taste, but for my money, a great novel, but gripping. I want to say thank you again so much. Thank you to our audience. It's for you, and we cannot make it happen without you, your questions and so on. Thank you to our panelists, Dr. Fogel, Dr. Anesko, and our dearly departed third panelist, Dr. Rowe. Sorry, I have amnesia. Don't worry about me. Thank you all so very much. I will say once again, if you have further questions, please send them to me, randall@nas.org, and I'll be delighted to forward them on to our panelists so they may have the option of responding to you. I will say this is part of our continuing webinar series, our American History webinar and our Great American Literature webinar. They are continuing. We are having history next, March 15th. That's the space race. And then I believe our next literature is going to be Jack London's Call of the Wild on April 5th, but there's a whole bunch others. It'll be very difficult to have them get up to the high level of this webinar, but we're certainly going to try our best. This webinar will be available, as all the webinars are, on the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel. It will be available within 24 hours. So again, thank you